Did medieval women actually have to prove their purity with bizarre rituals? Was a woman's worth truly measured by her untouched status from 500 CE to 1500 CE? Number 6. Chastity as a power play and social currency. The medieval world was a harsh stage where every action, especially a woman's, was scrutinized. Where chastity was not merely a personal virtue, it was a deeply ingrained social and political currency, a tool that could elevate or utterly destroy a woman and her family. A woman's virginity before marriage, and her fidelity within it, directly impacted dynastic succession, property inheritance, and diplomatic alliances. This fundamental connection meant that chastity, or its absence, was constantly under the microscope, used strategically by families, rulers, and even the church. It became a powerful, often unspoken, language of power and vulnerability. For noble families, a daughter's virginity was paramount for securing advantageous marriages. A king seeking to forge an alliance with a neighboring kingdom would send his daughter, and her virginity was a non-negotiable part of the deal. If any rumors of impurity preceded her, the alliance could collapse, leading to political instability or even war. The very legitimacy of a future heir depended on the undisputed chastity of his mother. If the queen's faithfulness was ever called into question, the entire royal line could be jeopardized, leading to civil strife and battles over succession. This made the concept of a chaste queen not just a moral ideal, but a political necessity. Dynastic marriages were often arranged when the bride was still a child, sometimes as young as 7 or 8, to ensure her untouched status. The wedding ceremony itself sometimes included rituals designed to publicly confirm the bride's virginity, though these were more symbolic than practical. For example, the presence of a witness to the consummation or the display of the stained sheet was a theatrical performance intended to quell any doubt and solidify the marriage's legitimacy in the eyes of the public and the church. Dowries were another area where chastity played a crucial role. A dowry was the property or money that a bride brought to her husband's family. Its value was often tied to the perceived worth and purity of the bride. A woman of questionable chastity might find her dowry diminished, or she might be unable to secure a marriage at all, effectively losing her social standing and economic security. In some cases, a woman who had lost her virginity before marriage might be forced into a less desirable union or consigned to a convent, not necessarily out of piety, but out of necessity to remove her taint from the marriage market. The family's reputation was at stake, and a daughter's perceived impurity could stain the entire lineage, impacting marriage prospects for her sisters and brothers. This made daughters not just heirs, but living embodiments of family honor, their bodies effectively a controlled asset. Accusations of unchastity were potent weapons in medieval power struggles. If a powerful lord wanted to invalidate a marriage or disinherit a rival, he might simply spread rumors about the wife's infidelity or the illegitimate birth of children. These accusations, even if unfounded, could be incredibly damaging, leading to public humiliation, divorce, or even charges of treason. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the High Middle Ages, faced relentless scrutiny regarding her chastity throughout her 2 marriages, first to Louis VII of France and then to Henry II of England. Rumors about her alleged infidelities were rampant, fueled by political rivals and her own outspoken nature. While many of these rumors were likely exaggerated or fabricated for political gain, they illustrate how a woman's perceived chastity could be manipulated to undermine her power and influence. Her divorce from Louis VII, though officially granted on grounds of consanguinity blood relation, was heavily influenced by the lack of a male heir and whispers about her conduct during the Second Crusade. In the legal realm, a woman's chastity also held sway. Ecclesiastical courts, which handled matters of marriage, divorce, and morality, often dealt with cases of adultery and fornication. For women, the penalties for these offenses could be severe, ranging from public penance and fines to social ostracization. A woman convicted of adultery might lose her dowry rights, her right to her children, and her social standing. For men, the consequences were often far less severe, highlighting the double standard prevalent in medieval society. This disparity underscores how chastity for women was not just a moral expectation, but a legal and economic imperative, intrinsically linked to their very survival and status. Consider the role of public shaming. A woman accused of sexual misconduct might be subjected to the humiliation of the cucking stool or paraded through the streets. These public displays served as stark warnings, reinforcing the social norms around female chastity. The very threat of such public disgrace often ensured compliance, as no woman wanted to be ostracized by her community. The collective gaze of the community, driven by religious teachings and social expectations, was a constant pressure to maintain an impeccable reputation. The threat of social ruin was often more powerful than legal penalties. Even within religious orders, chastity was a form of power, though of a different kind. For women who chose to become nuns, their virginity and celibacy were seen as pathways to spiritual authority. Abbesses, like Hildegard of Bingen or Heloise, gained considerable influence not despite their lack of marital status, but precisely because of their consecrated chastity. Their commitment to a life devoid of physical intimacy was perceived as a pure form of devotion, elevating their spiritual standing. However, even within convents, the purity of nuns was constantly monitored and sometimes questioned, showing that the societal obsession with female chastity permeated all aspects of life, sacred and secular. A convent's reputation and its ability to attract endowments and new recruits depended heavily on the perceived piety and moral uprightness of its inhabitants, especially their adherence to vows of celibacy. The strategic deployment of chastity was also evident in inheritance disputes. If a male heir was challenged, opponents might attempt to prove his illegitimacy by questioning his mother's fidelity. This was a direct attack on the mother's chastity, designed to invalidate the son's claim to land, titles, or wealth. For example, the succession crises in kingdoms like England and France often saw accusations of illegitimacy thrown around, directly targeting the chastity of the deceased king's wife. The fate of entire dynasties could hinge on whether a woman's sexual past was deemed impeccable. Chastity, therefore, was not a simple, personal choice for medieval women. It was a complex, multifaceted currency traded on the political, social, and economic markets of the time. It defined their worth, determined their future, and shaped the very fabric of medieval power structures. It was a condition of their existence, a constant negotiation between personal integrity and the immense pressures of a society that demanded it. Number 5. The chaste and holy woman of God. In the medieval world, while marriage and childbearing were often the prescribed paths for women, another, radically different option existed: a life dedicated to God, often accompanied by a vow of perpetual chastity. For some women, this was a forced reality, a consequence of being deemed unmarriageable or a convenient way for families to dispose of surplus daughters. For others, however, it was a conscious, deeply personal choice, a profound expression of faith that offered a unique kind of agency and authority, one that transcended the conventional societal roles. These women, the chaste and holy women of God, carved out a space where their spiritual purity, rather than their marital status, became their defining characteristic and their source of influence. The ideal of the Bride of Christ was a powerful one, offering spiritual solace and an alternative identity to women who rejected or were denied earthly marriage. By dedicating themselves to God through vows of celibacy, poverty, and obedience, women could join monastic orders, becoming nuns, anchoresses, or beguines. These paths offered opportunities for education, intellectual pursuits, and spiritual development that were largely unavailable to married women. In convents, women could learn to read and write Latin, engage in theological discourse, copy manuscripts, and even compose their own works. Figures like Hrotsvita of Gandersheim, a 10th century Benedictine nun, wrote plays and poems in Latin, something almost unheard of for women outside the cloister. Her works, celebrating chaste virgins and saints, directly reflected the values of her chosen life. And anchoresses like Julian of Norwich exemplified extreme forms of chosen chastity and devotion. An anchoress would voluntarily be enclosed in a small cell attached to a church, living a life of solitary prayer, contemplation, and strict asceticism. This enclosure was permanent, often marked by a symbolic funeral ceremony, signifying her death to the world. For Julian, this isolation fostered profound mystical experiences, which she later recorded in her Revelations of Divine Love, one of the earliest surviving books written by a woman in the English language. Her unwavering commitment to a celibate life and service to God was seen as a testament to her spiritual strength and enabled her to become a respected spiritual advisor to pilgrims and visitors who sought her wisdom through a small window. This extreme chastity was not just about physical purity, it was about purifying the soul and drawing closer to the divine. The veneration of virgin martyrs was a cornerstone of medieval Christianity, providing powerful role models for women embracing chastity. Saints like Agnes, Catherine of Alexandria, Margaret of Antioch, and Lucy were celebrated for fiercely defending their virginity against pagan persecutors, often enduring horrific tortures rather than compromising their purity or their faith. Their stories, widely disseminated through hagiographies, saints' lives, sermons, and visual art, instilled the idea that virginity was a treasure worth dying for. These narratives emphasized the spiritual triumph over earthly desires and the ultimate reward of heavenly glory. For women living in convents or aspiring to a religious life, these virgin martyrs were not just distant figures, but tangible examples of the power and sanctity that could be achieved through unwavering commitment to chastity. The Beguine movement, which flourished in the Low Countries during the 13th and 14th centuries, offered another avenue for women to live a devout, chaste life without formal monastic vows. Beguines were laywomen who lived together in communities, devoting themselves to prayer, charity, and manual labor, often without permanent vows of poverty or enclosure. While they maintained their chastity, they retained a degree of independence and flexibility not found in traditional convents. This allowed women from various social strata, including those who were poor or widowed, to pursue a spiritual life focused on personal devotion and good works. Figures like Mechthild of Magdeburg, a German Beguine mystic, wrote extensively about her spiritual experiences, advocating for a personal, intense relationship with God that transcended conventional religious structures, all within a life of consecrated chastity. The choices made by these women were not always straightforward or universally praised, and families might resist a daughter's desire to enter a convent, especially if she was their only heir or if they needed her for an advantageous marriage. Some women had to fight against societal expectations and familial pressures to pursue their spiritual calling. However, once within the framework of a recognized religious life, their chastity became a source of immense respect and, in some cases, power. Abbesses, for example, could wield significant administrative, economic, and even political influence, managing large estates, overseeing communities of nuns, and engaging in correspondence with powerful secular and ecclesiastical figures. Their authority was rooted in their perceived spiritual purity and their adherence to strict religious vows, with chastity being central. Margery Kempe, a 15th century English mystic, represents a unique case of a married woman who negotiated a vow of chastity with her husband. After experiencing profound religious visions, Margery felt called to a life of spiritual devotion, which included celibacy. She eventually convinced her husband to agree to a vow of chastity, allowing her to live a life of pilgrimage and intense prayer, distinct from conventional marital duties. This was an extraordinary step for a married woman, demonstrating the lengths to which some individuals would go to embrace spiritual chastity, even within a secular context. Her Book of Margery Kempe provides a rare, first-hand account of a medieval woman navigating her spiritual calling and its social implications. Her tears and loud cries, often accompanying her visions, were sometimes seen as a sign of her extreme piety, sometimes as a nuisance or even a sign of madness, but her chosen chastity was undeniable. For medieval women, becoming a bride of Christ was a radical act of self-definition. It allowed them to transcend the limited roles of wife and mother, offering a path to spiritual authority, intellectual growth, and personal autonomy within a highly structured society. Their chosen chastity was not a negation of their being, but a transformation of it, a powerful statement of devotion that earned them reverence, influence, and a unique place in the spiritual landscape of the Middle Ages. They were not just women without men. They were women of God, their bodies and souls dedicated to a higher purpose, their chastity a testament to their unwavering faith. Number 4, the pious and enduring widow. In the intricate social fabric of the medieval period, the widow occupied a unique and often precarious position. Her husband's death plunged her into a world of complex legalities, economic uncertainties, and intense social scrutiny. While some widows quickly remarried, often out of necessity or family pressure, a significant number chose to remain chaste, dedicating themselves to their late husband's memory, their children, or, increasingly, to a life of pious devotion. The ideal of the pious and enduring widow was deeply embedded in medieval society, encouraged by the church, and often seen as a testament to her virtue and loyalty. This choice, or sometimes necessity, to remain chaste offered a distinct form of agency and sometimes considerable power, yet it also came with its own set of challenges and expectations. The church actively promoted the idea of the chaste widow. In biblical passages, particularly those from St. Paul in the New Testament, lauded the virtues of widows who did not remarry, but instead devoted themselves to prayer and good works. This theological emphasis translated into widespread social acceptance and even veneration for those who chose perpetual widowhood and celibacy. Such women were seen as examples of piety and restraint, models of Christian virtue in a world often perceived as sinful. This spiritual endorsement provided a strong incentive for many widows to maintain their chastity, earning them respect and a degree of moral authority within their communities. They were often viewed as spiritual guides, wise counsel, and devoted caretakers of the church. Economically, a widow's situation was complex. Dower rights, which were legal provisions granting a widow a portion of her late husband's estate, typically 1/3 for her lifetime, provided some financial security. However, these rights were often contingent on her remaining chaste and not remarrying, especially if the dower land was meant to revert to her husband's family upon her death or remarriage. If she remarried, her dower might be lost, or her new husband would gain control over it. Therefore, for many women, remaining chaste was a pragmatic financial decision, ensuring their economic independence and the security of their children's inheritance. A widow who controlled her dower lands, especially if they were substantial, could wield considerable economic power, managing estates, engaging in trade, and even acting as feudal lords in their own right, a position often unavailable to married women whose property was legally controlled by their husbands. For noblewomen, widowhood could offer an unexpected path to political influence. A widowed countess or duchess, acting as regent for her young son, could rule vast territories, negotiate treaties, and command armies. Her continued chastity was often essential to maintaining her legitimacy and preventing challenges from ambitious relatives. Blanche of Castile, the mother of Louis IX of France, served as regent for her young son and proved to be an exceptionally capable ruler. Her unwavering devotion to her late husband's memory and her impeccable reputation for chastity helped solidify her authority and ensured the stability of the French kingdom during her regency. Her pious demeanor and commitment to moral rectitude were key components of her successful governance, reinforcing the link between chaste widowhood and legitimate power. The decision to remain chaste also allowed many widows to exert control over their children's upbringing and future marriages. Without a new husband to dictate terms, a widow had greater autonomy in arranging suitable matches for her sons and daughters, securing their positions in society. This was particularly true for widows who controlled significant wealth or property. Their independence, safeguarded by their chaste status, allowed them to act as heads of households and guardians of their family's legacy. They could ensure that their deceased husband's lineage continued unimpeded by a new stepfather's interests. However, the path of the chaste widow was not without its pressures. While praised by the church, unmarried women were also seen as vulnerable to temptation or social disruption. The church and society at large actively encouraged widows to maintain a pious and sober lifestyle, avoiding public gatherings or displays that might compromise their reputation. Widows often adopted a distinctive, somber dress, signaling their status and their commitment to a life of mourning and quiet devotion. They were expected to live modestly, dedicate themselves to prayer, and engage in charitable works. This emphasis on outward piety reinforced their chaste image. Literary examples also reflected the ideal of the pious widow. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the wife of Bath is a notable exception to this ideal, having married 5 times and being anything but chaste. Her portrayal serves as a stark contrast, highlighting the societal norms that she so brazenly defied and confirming the strong expectation of chaste widowhood. The Tale of Melibea and the Parson's Tale in Chaucer's collection, however, frequently reference the virtues of widows, echoing the church's teachings and reinforcing the positive perception of those who chose to remain unmarried and pure. For those who chose to enter religious life, widowhood offered a pathway to spiritual solace and intellectual engagement. Many convents were populated by women who had lost their husbands, finding a new purpose in communal prayer, scholarship, and service. This was a particularly appealing option for women who had no children, or whose children were grown, allowing them to dedicate their later years entirely to God. These women often became respected figures within their religious communities, their experience and maturity valued by their sisters. The chaste and enduring widow, therefore, was a complex figure in medieval society. Her decision to remain chaste, whether driven by religious conviction, economic necessity, or a desire for autonomy, was a powerful act. It allowed her to redefine her identity beyond that of a wife, to exercise control over her life and legacy, and to attain a revered status in a society that often limited women's choices. Her chastity was not merely an absence of sexual relations, but a positive affirmation of piety, loyalty, and a particular kind of strength. Number 3, the sinful seductress. The medieval worldview was deeply shaped by Christian theology, and within this framework, the story of Eve in the Garden of Eden cast a long and often dark shadow over the perception of women. Eve's transgression, tempting Adam to eat the forbidden fruit, was interpreted not just as a singular act of disobedience, but as a fundamental flaw in female nature. This theological narrative gave rise to the enduring fable of the sinful seductress, portraying women as inherently more susceptible to lust, weaker in moral resolve, and thus a constant source of temptation and danger to men. This perception permeated medieval culture, influencing everything from religious sermons and philosophical treatises to popular literature and legal codes, creating a pervasive atmosphere of suspicion around female sexuality. The church fathers and theologians, such as St. Augustine, solidified the idea that women were the primary instigators of sin, echoing Eve's role. Their writings emphasized the physical and spiritual weakness of women, suggesting that their beauty and allure were deceptive traps leading men to damnation. Sermons often warned congregations against the dangers of female vanity and immodesty, linking these traits directly to sexual sin. Women were admonished to dress modestly, cover their hair, and avoid any behavior that might inflame male desires. This emphasis on female responsibility for male lust placed an enormous burden on women to regulate their appearance and conduct, effectively blaming them for the sins of men. The idea was that women needed strict control and supervision, as their innate tendency to sin could corrupt society. The sinful seductress trope manifested powerfully in medieval art and literature. Illuminated manuscripts and church carvings often depicted Eve as the serpent's ally, sometimes even with a serpentine lower body herself, highlighting her deceptive nature. Morality plays and allegories frequently featured female characters who personified vice, particularly lust and vanity, leading virtuous male characters astray. The Romance of the Rose, a hugely popular 13th century French poem, while complex and multi-layered, contains passages that describe women as cunning, deceptive, and prone to manipulation, often using their beauty to ensnare men. These literary portrayals reinforce the notion that women were not only sexually dangerous but also intellectually inferior and morally untrustworthy. Legal systems reflected this bias. While both men and women could be accused of sexual offenses, women often faced harsher penalties for transgressions like fornication or adultery. A woman's reputation for chastity was far more fragile and easily damaged than a man's, and once stained, it was incredibly difficult to restore. A man accused of adultery might face a fine or public penance, but a woman could lose her dowry, her children, and her social standing, sometimes even facing physical punishment or banishment. The legal framework implicitly assumed that women were more culpable in sexual matters, given their supposed inherent weakness and their role as temptresses. The fear of female sexuality was also tied to concerns about lineage and inheritance. If a woman was seen as a sinful seductress, her fidelity within marriage could be questioned, leading to doubts about the legitimacy of her children. This had profound implications for noble families and royal houses, where the undisputed legitimacy of heirs was paramount for succession. Accusations of a queen's infidelity were often wielded as political weapons, aimed at destabilizing thrones and undermining rival claims. This shows how the abstract theological concept of the sinful seductress had very real, tangible consequences for women's lives and power dynamics. The perception of women as inherently lustful and dangerous also contributed to the rise of ascetic practices among both men and women. Monastic life, with its vows of celibacy, was seen as a way to escape the temptations of the flesh, often explicitly associated with female seduction. Monks and priests were exhorted to avoid contact with women, even their own mothers or sisters, to maintain their purity. This fear of female temptation further isolated women from positions of religious authority and intellectual influence outside of specific female religious orders. The witchcraft trials of the late medieval period, while gaining full force later, had roots in the suspicion of female power and sexuality. Women accused of witchcraft were often seen as having succumbed to the devil's temptations, explicitly linking their alleged sorcery to their supposed moral depravity and uncontrolled sexuality. The Malleus Maleficarum, a notorious 15th century treatise on witchcraft, explicitly states that women are more prone to witchcraft than men because of their inherent weakness and lust, directly echoing the sinful seductress trope. This demonstrates the extreme and dangerous manifestations of this deeply ingrained societal fear. Not all medieval texts or thinkers presented women solely as seductresses. Christine de Pizan, a groundbreaking 15th century author, actively challenged these misogynistic views in her book of the City of Ladies. She argued passionately for the virtue, intelligence, and moral strength of women, presenting examples of historical and legendary figures who defied the negative stereotypes. Her work was a direct rebuttal to the pervasive sinful seductress narrative, though it was an uphill battle against centuries of entrenched beliefs. Despite such intellectual resistance, the fable of the sinful seductress remained a potent cultural force throughout the Middle Ages. It shaped perceptions of women's roles, justified their subjugation, and instilled a deep-seated fear of female sexuality. It served as a powerful mechanism for social control, ensuring that women understood their supposed moral limitations and the severe consequences of straying from the narrow path of prescribed chastity. This pervasive narrative, rooted in a foundational religious story, painted women not just as vulnerable to temptation, but as its very embodiment. Number 2, the steadfast and silent wife. The institution of marriage in the medieval period was not primarily a romantic union. It was a foundational social and economic contract, often arranged to consolidate wealth, forge alliances, or secure lineage. Within this framework, the ideal medieval wife was expected to embody a specific set of virtues, chief among them being steadfast loyalty, unwavering obedience, and absolute chastity. This pervasive expectation gave rise to the fable of the steadfast and silent wife, a woman whose worth was measured by her unquestioning fidelity, her quiet submission to her husband's authority, and her diligent management of the household, all while maintaining an impeccable reputation for purity. This ideal, heavily promoted by both the church and secular society, placed immense pressure on women to suppress their own desires and aspirations in favor of their husband's will and the family's honor. The concept of wifely fidelity was paramount, far more so than a husband's fidelity. A wife's chastity was directly linked to the legitimacy of her children, which in turn secured the family's inheritance and dynastic continuity. If a wife's fidelity was ever questioned, the entire lineage could be jeopardized, leading to property disputes, social disgrace, and even accusations of illegitimacy against her children. This placed an immense burden on women to remain above suspicion to avoid any behavior that might even hint at infidelity. The Church's teachings reinforce this, portraying marriage as a sacred bond and adultery as a grave sin, with particular emphasis on the wife's transgression. Canonical law held that a wife's adultery could be grounds for divorce, while a husband's often was not, unless it was combined with other egregious offenses. The silent aspect of the ideal wife underscored the expectation of obedience and non-confrontation. Wives were expected to manage the household efficiently, raise children, and oversee servants, but always under the authority of their husband. Public speaking, or asserting one's opinion too forcefully, was often frowned upon, seen as a challenge to male dominance. The literature of the period, such as courtesy books or guides for young women, frequently advised modesty, humility, and silence as desirable wifely traits. A woman's virtue was often equated with her quiet demeanor and her acceptance of her subordinate role. For example, in the book of The Knight of the Tour Landry, a 14th century guide for his daughters, the author recounts numerous stories of wives who suffer because of their outspokenness or infidelity, contrasting them with those who are praised for their quiet obedience and chaste conduct. One of the most famous literary examples of the steadfast and silent wife is Griselda, a character from Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, and later adapted by Geoffrey Chaucer in The Clerk's Tale in the Canterbury Tales. Griselda, a peasant woman, marries a marquis who subjects her to a series of unimaginable cruelties to test her patience and obedience. He takes away her children, feigns their deaths, and even pretends to divorce her to marry another woman who is, in fact, her own daughter. Through all of this, Griselda remains unfailingly loyal, obedient, and silent, never complaining or questioning her husband's actions. She maintains her unwavering chastity and commitment to him, even when publicly humiliated. While Griselda's tale is an extreme and often disturbing portrayal, it clearly illustrates the medieval ideal of a wife's absolute fidelity and submission, even in the face of immense suffering. Her unyielding chastity and patience are presented as ultimate virtues, even if her tormentor's actions are morally reprehensible. Real historical women also face these pressures. Queens, even those with considerable personal power like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Matilda of England, were constantly under scrutiny regarding their fidelity and their ability to produce legitimate heirs. Rumors of infidelity or barrenness could lead to political instability or even the dissolution of their marriages. Queens were expected to be models of piety and chastity, their personal conduct reflecting on the legitimacy of their entire royal line. Their marriages were often arranged for political reasons, and their personal desires were secondary to dynastic needs. For women in lower social strata, the pressures were equally strong, though perhaps less public. A peasant wife's chastity was vital for the security of her family's land tenure and reputation within the village. Accusations of infidelity could lead to fines from manorial courts, social ostracism, or even the breakdown of her marriage, which could be economically devastating. The concept of shame and honor was deeply ingrained in communal life, and a wife's perceived infidelity brought shame upon her entire household. Community pressure, reinforced by religious teachings, kept many women compliant with these expectations. The role of women in the household was also integral to their reputation. Wives were expected to be diligent managers of resources, ensuring the household ran smoothly, whether it was a peasant cottage or a noble castle. Their domestic efficiency was seen as a reflection of their moral uprightness and their commitment to their husband's interests. A well-run household, free from scandal, was a testament to the steadfast and silent wife's virtues. This involved managing food supplies, overseeing servants, caring for children, and often participating in agricultural labor or craft production. Even in religious life, the ideal of spiritual fidelity echoed the marital ideal. Nuns, for example, were considered brides of Christ and were expected to maintain absolute spiritual and physical chastity, embodying the ultimate form of unwavering loyalty to their divine spouse. This shows how deeply the concept of unwavering devotion and purity, often in the face of spiritual or earthly trials, was ingrained in medieval thought, whether applied to human marriage or divine union. The fable of the steadfast and silent wife, while presenting an unattainable ideal for many, clearly defined the societal expectations for medieval married women. It emphasized absolute fidelity, quiet obedience, and a focus on domestic duties, all underpinned by an unblemished reputation for chastity. While this restricted women's autonomy and expression, it also defined a path to respectability and security within the rigid social structures of the time. The unwavering loyalty and silence were not just virtues, but necessities for survival and social acceptance. Number 1. The Untainted Virgin Bride. The medieval world placed an almost unimaginable emphasis on a woman's virginity before marriage. It was not merely a personal attribute, it was a sacred treasure, a legal requirement, a social imperative, and the cornerstone of family honor and dynastic survival. The enduring fable of the untainted virgin bride permeated every aspect of medieval society, shaping expectations for women from their earliest years and determining their marriage prospects, their social standing, and the very legitimacy of their future children. The value placed on an untouched bride was immense, far outweighing almost any other consideration in the marriage market, and its loss could bring ruin not just to the woman, but to her entire lineage. The paramount importance of virginity stemmed from several interconnected factors. Theologically, the Church held virginity in the highest esteem, viewing it as a state of purity closest to God, an echo of the Virgin Mary's Immaculate Conception. While marriage was a sacrament, premarital sex was a grave sin, and a bride's untouched status was seen as a sign of her piety and moral uprightness. This religious sanction imbued virginity with a spiritual significance that went beyond mere physical integrity. A virgin bride symbolized purity, entering into the sacred bond of matrimony. Legally and economically, virginity was intrinsically linked to inheritance and lineage. For noble families, a daughter's virginity was a non-negotiable prerequisite for securing an advantageous marriage. It was the ultimate guarantee of the legitimacy of any future heirs. If a bride was not a virgin, it raised immediate questions about the paternity of her children, potentially jeopardizing the transfer of land, titles, and wealth. A powerful lord or king would demand an undisputed virgin bride to ensure the unblemished succession of his line. Royal and noble marriages were often preceded by meticulous investigations into the bride's background, sometimes even involving physical examinations, though these were more rare and often considered invasive. The very act of marriage was often meant to confirm the transfer of sexual control from father to husband, with virginity being the sign of that unbroken chain of control. Dowries were directly influenced by a bride's virginity. A substantial dowry, the property or money a bride brought to her husband's family, was often contingent on her untouched status. A woman who was not a virgin would command a significantly smaller dowry, or might even be unmarriageable in the conventional sense, potentially relegated to a convent or a life of obscurity. The loss of virginity outside of marriage was a severe blow to a woman's value in the marriage market, making her a liability rather than an asset. This economic reality placed immense pressure on families to guard their daughters' virginity with extreme vigilance. Socially, a woman's virginity was inextricably linked to her family's honor. A daughter's perceived impurity brought shame and dishonor not just upon herself, but upon her parents, siblings, and wider kin. This collective shame could impact the marriage prospects of her sisters and brothers, tainting the family's reputation in the community. Public rumor and gossip, potent forces in medieval society, could quickly destroy a woman's reputation, making her a social pariah. Therefore, families went to great lengths to protect their daughter's chastity, sometimes through strict chaperonage, early betrothals, or even physical seclusion. The honor of the family was tied directly to the honor of its women, particularly their sexual integrity. Literary narratives of the period frequently celebrated the untainted virgin bride. Arthurian romances, for instance, are replete with virtuous maidens who represent the ideal of purity and innocence, often becoming the object of knights' quests and devotion. Characters like Guinevere, in her initial portrayal, embodies this ideal, though her later story complicates it. The Roman de la Rose, a sprawling 13th century allegorical poem, uses the image of a rose as a symbol of female virginity to be carefully guarded and won. While controversial in its later sections, the initial parts emphasize the sanctity and desirability of the untouched maiden. The marriage ceremony itself sometimes included symbolic rituals intended to confirm the bride's virginity. While widespread physical examinations were not common practice, the display of a blood-stained sheet after the wedding night was a highly symbolic act in some regions and social classes, meant to publicly affirm the consummation and the bride's prior untouched status. This public declaration served to quell any doubts and solidify the legitimacy of the marriage and any future offspring. While the practical efficacy of such a ritual is debatable, its symbolic power in medieval society was immense, reinforcing the public's expectation of the untainted bride. For women who lost their virginity before marriage, the consequences were severe. They might be forced into a shotgun wedding with the man responsible, if he was willing, often with a reduced dowry. If not, they faced social ostracism, economic destitution, and moral condemnation. They might be sent to a convent if they had the means, effectively removed from society or relegated to a life of service with little prospect of marriage. The stigma attached to a non-virgin bride was profound and often lifelong, illustrating the unforgiving nature of medieval societal norms. Even for women who chose a religious life, virginity was highly valued. Nuns, who were considered brides of Christ, took vows of perpetual virginity and celibacy, elevating their spiritual status. Many convents preferred to admit virgins, seeing their untouched status as a sign of greater spiritual purity and dedication to God. This further cemented the idea that an untainted body was a vessel for spiritual grace. The fable of the untainted virgin bride, therefore, was not a whimsical tale but a deeply ingrained cultural reality. It determined a woman's destiny, shaped her identity, and dictated her worth in a society where female sexuality was rigorously controlled and publicly policed. Her virginity was not just a personal matter, it was a communal asset, a family legacy, and a linchpin of the entire social order. Its preservation was paramount, its loss catastrophic, making the untainted bride a powerful, if restrictive, ideal.